The blue lights hit your rearview mirror before your brain even catches up. 1 second you're driving, maybe thinking about dinner or a phone call you forgot to return, and the next second, your chest tightens. You glance at your speed, check your mirrors again, and that familiar thought creeps in. What did I do? Your hands start to feel a little heavier on the steering wheel. You slow down, signal, pull over. The officer steps out of the patrol car, and already, before a single word is exchanged, the situation is unfolding in ways most people don't fully understand. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Have you ever been in a traffic stop where you felt like the officer was pushing boundaries or acting in a way that didn't sit right with you? If you have, drop your experience in the comments, because what you think happened and what actually happened might not be the same thing. And there's a part of this story that most people miss until it's too late. Now, here's where things get interesting. People love to believe that if an officer crosses the line, there's immediate accountability, that bad cops get caught quickly, fired, and that's the end of it. Clean, simple, reassuring. But that's not how it always works in the real world. There are cases, real ones, where an officer gets fired for misconduct, charged with a crime, then somehow finds their way back onto the force, only to get fired again. And when you really dig into those situations, you start to see a pattern that should make every driver pay attention, not just to what officers do, but to how you respond during those few critical minutes on the side of the road. Because here's the truth most people don't like to hear. Even when an officer is in the wrong, your behavior in that moment can still make things much worse for you. Picture this scenario. You're pulled over late at night. The officer walks up slowly, shines a flashlight inside your vehicle, scans the interior, your hands, your passengers. That light isn't random. It's deliberate. Officers are trained to observe everything in seconds: movement, eye contact, nervousness, anything out of place. Where are you coming from tonight? It sounds casual. It's not. This is where most drivers make their first mistake. They treat it like small talk. They start explaining their evening, adding details, sometimes even volunteering information that has nothing to do with the stop. From the officer's perspective, every word you say is data, not just the content, but how you say it. Hesitation, over-explaining, contradictions, these are cues they're trained to pick up on. Now imagine this same officer has a history, complaints, maybe internal investigations. Let's say they've already been accused of stretching the truth in reports or pushing stops further than necessary. That's where the situation becomes more dangerous, not less, because you don't know that history in the moment. And here's the twist that surprises people. Even if that officer has been fired before, even if they were charged, there are circumstances where they come back. Appeals, union protections, procedural errors in the disciplinary process. These things happen. So now you've got someone on the roadside who may already have a record of questionable behavior, and you're expected to navigate that interaction perfectly. Let's go deeper. The officer asks for your license, registration, and insurance. You hand them over. Pretty standard. But then they hold on to your documents longer than expected. Minutes pass. Then more minutes. At this point, a lot of drivers start to feel the pressure build. They shift in their seat. They check their mirrors. They wonder if they should say something. Here's what's happening from the officer's side. Time is a tool. The longer you sit there, the more likely you are to become anxious, to make a mistake, to say something unnecessary if they come back with more questions. Now imagine an officer who has previously been disciplined for prolonging stops without justification, someone who's already crossed that line before. If they're back on duty, they may be more careful, or they may double down and try to be more subtle. That's why understanding your rights isn't just about knowing what's legal. It's about recognizing behavior patterns. Let's say the officer returns and changes tone slightly. Step out of the vehicle for me. Now your heart rate spikes. This is where things get very real. Many drivers don't realize that in most situations, officers can legally ask you to step out of the car during a traffic stop. That alone isn't misconduct, but how it's done, why it's done, and what follows, that's where things can cross into questionable territory. You step out, the officer positions you near the back of your car. Maybe they start asking the same questions again. Where are you coming from? Have you had anything to drink tonight? Anyone else in the car been drinking? Repetition isn't accidental. It's a technique. They're looking for inconsistencies. Now, here's where people get tripped up. They think if they just answer everything clearly, the officer will see they have nothing to hide and let them go. But if the officer is already suspicious, or worse, if they're the kind of officer who's been accused of creating suspicion where none exists, your answers might not change the outcome. This is where silence, or at least controlled communication, becomes critical. And yet, this is also where tension escalates. Because when a driver says something like, "I'd rather not answer any questions," the atmosphere shifts instantly. Some officers respect that, others don't. An officer with a clean record might handle it professionally, stick to the purpose of the stop, and move on. An officer with a history of misconduct? That's unpredictable. They might push harder. They might imply that your refusal is suspicious. They might start looking for other reasons to extend the stop. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Even if that behavior is later found to be improper, you're the one dealing with the immediate consequences. Now, let's talk about passengers, because this is another area where things can spiral. The officer walks to the passenger side. "Hey, where are you guys headed?" Passengers often feel less prepared than drivers. They might answer differently. They might joke, hesitate, or contradict something the driver said earlier. That's all it takes. Now the officer has a reason, at least in their mind, to dig deeper. And if this officer has a track record of pushing stops into searches, they may start looking for probable cause or consent. Mind if I take a quick look inside the vehicle? That word, consent, is huge, because once you say yes, you've given them permission, and undoing that later is nearly impossible. This is where drivers need to be very clear-headed, even under pressure. But pressure is exactly what's being applied. The tone might stay polite, but the underlying message is there. Refusing might make things worse. Now, imagine this same officer, who's been fired once before for improper searches, is trying to avoid obvious mistakes. They may phrase things carefully. They may rely more on your reactions than their own actions. That's why understanding the psychology of these stops matters so much. Let's shift back to the bigger picture. When you hear about a corrupt officer getting fired, charged, then rehired and fired again, it's easy to focus on the outrage. And there should be outrage. But there's also a lesson hidden in those stories. Accountability systems aren't instant. They're messy. They involve investigations, hearings, appeals. And during that time, officers may still be interacting with the public. That means the burden, in those moments, often falls on you to handle the situation as carefully as possible. And here's where I need to challenge a common myth. A lot of people believe that if an officer is acting improperly, they can call it out on the spot, argue, demand a supervisor, and everything will straighten out right there on the roadside. That's not how it usually plays out. In reality, challenging an officer mid-stop, especially one who's already operating on questionable judgment, can escalate things quickly. Now you've got tension, ego, and authority all colliding in a confined space. The officer might become more rigid, less willing to de-escalate, more likely to look for any justification to take further action. That doesn't mean you don't have rights. It means timing matters. There's a difference between asserting your rights calmly and trying to win an argument on the side of the road. One protects you. The other can put you in a worse position, even if you're technically correct. Let's go into another scenario that people rarely think about. The officer goes back to their car with your documents. You wait. And wait. At some point, they return with a warning or a ticket. But instead of ending the stop, they linger. They keep talking, asking more questions unrelated to the reason you were pulled over. This is a critical moment, because legally, once the purpose of the stop is complete, extending it without reasonable suspicion can become problematic. But here's the catch. Most drivers don't recognize when that line has been crossed. They stay engaged in conversation, thinking it's still part of the process. And that's where officers, especially those with a history of bending rules, can take advantage of the gray area. They rely on your uncertainty. They rely on the fact that you don't want to appear rude or uncooperative. So the conversation continues, and suddenly you're in a situation that goes far beyond a simple traffic stop. Now let's talk about documentation, because this is where things often come back full circle. If an officer writes a report that doesn't accurately reflect what happened, that becomes a serious issue. And in cases where officers have been fired and rehired, false or misleading reports are often part of the story. But here's the reality. Your word against theirs isn't always enough. That's why more drivers are using dash cams, recording interactions, or at least being very mindful of what's said and done during a stop. Not to provoke, not to challenge, but to create a record. Because if something goes wrong, that record might be the difference between being believed or not. And this ties back to the larger issue. When an officer is fired, it usually means there's been a significant problem. When they're charged, it's even more serious. But when they're rehired, it often means something in the process allowed them back in. And when they're fired again, it tells you the underlying issue wasn't fully resolved. So what does that mean for you? Sitting in your car with those blue lights behind you. It means you can't assume every officer you encounter is operating at the same standard. Most are professional. Most follow the rules. But it only takes one who doesn't to turn a routine stop into something much bigger. And the way you handle those few minutes can shape everything that follows. Your tone, your words, your decisions. Even something as simple as how quickly you respond to a question, or whether you volunteer extra information, can influence how the officer perceives you. And perception, in these situations, carries a lot of weight. So when you're sitting there, engine idling, hands on the wheel, waiting for the officer to approach, understand this. The stop has already started before the first word is spoken. They're watching. You're reacting. And in that space between action and reaction, small choices can have big consequences. That's why I always tell people, don't just memorize your rights. Understand the dynamics. Understand why officers ask certain questions. Understand how your behavior is being interpreted. Understand that even if an officer is in the wrong, your goal in that moment is to get through the stop safely and cleanly. There's a time to challenge, a time to file complaints, a time to take legal action if necessary. But the roadside, with adrenaline high and uncertainty in the air, is rarely the place where things get resolved. And when you hear stories about officers being fired, charged, rehired, and fired again, don't just shake your head and move on. Think about what that means for real-world interactions. Think about how easily a situation can escalate when one side holds authority and the other side is trying to navigate it without full information. Because the next time those blue lights hit your mirror, it won't be a headline or a story. It'll be you, your decisions, and a situation that can change direction faster than most people expect.